began to face up to declines in our membership and finances. The Conference Council on Finance and Administration was probably the first to know that we are in uncharted waters, and they sought guidance in aligning the shrinking budget to reflect the missional and strategic priorities of the conference. But there was no leadership body to which they could turn. Following the adage, "Never let a good crisis go to waste," Bishop Dick undertook the landscape survey as a comprehensive examination of our conference and our way of being in ministry together. Then she convened the landscape task force to dig deeper and evaluate the results. Will the members of the landscape task force please stand and remain standing? After a series of lay and clergy listening sessions all around the conference, the Landscape Task Force introduced legislation in 2016 to form yet another task force to design a new organizational structure to provide the overarching leadership that was previously lacking. Well, so will members of the organizational task force please stand and remain standing? After 9 months of intense work, including another round of listening sessions across the conference, the Organizational Task Force introduced legislation last year to form the annual conference shepherding team. You may recall that not only did the Organizational Task Force submit formal written legislation, it made a lengthy presentation on Monday morning that included a memorable skit and a creative video, among other things. It invited written questions and returned on Monday evening to respond to the written questions and to questions and comments from the floor. So all of that, the lengthy presentation and the Q&A, occurred before the legislation was put to a vote and the annual conference shepherding team was created. So now will the annual conference shepherding team please stand and remain standing? Last year's legislation also created shepherding teams in each district for the purpose of coordinating and communicating our ministry among local churches and with the annual conference. So now will members of the district shepherding teams please stand and remain standing? Finally, if you attended any of those listening sessions in the winter of 2016 or the winter of 2017, please stand. Northern Illinois Conference, these are the people whose work and input have brought us to this point. Thank you. Now you may all be seated. Before Reverend McCoy and I launch into our report on the annual conference shepherding team, we would like to take this opportunity to review and clarify its structure. The legislation that was adopted last year that created the annual conference shepherding team and the district shepherding teams foresaw that the standing rules of the Northern Illinois Conference would have to be updated to incorporate these new bodies. This year, document 702.02 is intended to do just that. Originally, it was on the preliminary consent calendar, but as Reverend Katie Voigt explained this morning, there was a petition to lift it from the consent calendar. So now, document 702.02, the incorporation of the annual conference shepherding team and the district shepherding team into the standing rules, will be presented on its own for a vote. So since the structure itself appears to be back on the table, I would like to remind you of some of the rationale we discussed last year. I'd like to start with size. If you attended annual conference last year or any of the listening sessions that preceded it, you will recall that the organizational task force gave a lot of thought to the size of the annual conference shepherding team. We wanted it to function as a committee of the whole, so we deliberately held its size to 20 members. We felt that if it grew any bigger, there would have to be a smaller executive committee, either formally created or one that would just develop out of practice, and that small group would end up making all the decisions and controlling the process. So we expressly sought to avoid that by limiting the size. So given that the annual conference shepherding team was deliberately kept small, it was never intended to be a representative body. Instead, the positions were identified to keep us mindful of many of the features that went into the organizational structure. For instance, the 4 core areas that were identified by the landscape. Those are congregational life, clergy life, missional life, and connectional resources. Also, it's meant to ensure diversity, which is a high priority for our annual conference and for the annual conference shepherding team. And finally, to align with our goals of coordinating and communicating ministry. So on your tables, you have a list of the members of the annual conference shepherding team and sort of the positions that were identified as being necessary for all of these goals. So you'll see that we have 20 voting members. 6 of those members are representatives of the district shepherding teams. 8 are the 2 co-chairs. 1 is the chair of the Council on Finance and Administration, and you'll recall that it was their need that caused the creation of this body in the first place. They wanted the guidance of this body. And for a similar reason, the Board of Trustees is represented. Then you'll see that the chair of the Board of Ordained Ministries is on the shepherding team, and that's to lift up the value of clergy life. You'll see that 1 of the 3 conference lay leaders is on the shepherding team, and that's to lift up the value of congregational life. The chair of nominations is on the shepherding team, and that's to facilitate that coordination in ministry that's so important to us. Also, the chair of the annual conference committee is on the shepherding team, and that's to facilitate the goal of communication and also communication or coordination of ministry. And you might see that in the future, annual conference is somewhat different now that the shepherding team is up and running. The 3 ethnic caucuses are represented, and that's not only to ensure diversity in membership, but also to ensure advocacy of diverse experiences and perspectives. And finally, there are 3 designates of ministry areas. The legislation expressly listed 34 ministry areas and grouped them into 3 separate sort of categories: church development and revitalization, age-level ministries, justice and mercy ministries. The legislation spells out how the 34 ministry areas will nominate designates. You see, we use the term designate, not representative, that will keep the annual conference shepherding team mindful of the core area of missional life. So with all of that as background, we're going to return to our regularly scheduled programming. And so the annual conference shepherding team report. Unlike those prior task forces, the annual conference shepherding team has no legislation to offer this year. We do not have a tidy package of leadership trainings, mission projects, or Bible studies that will solve all our problems. In fact, we are intentionally resisting our natural inclinations to plumb our years of experience to offer a quick fix.
Instead, this year we offer a word, literally a word, liminal, which you heard about from Mark Manzi in the laity address this afternoon. The word liminal was new to many of us, and it may be to many of you. But it helped us to understand and accept where we are as an annual conference. The word liminal comes from the Latin root limen, which means threshold. The threshold space becomes a liminal space when, for whatever reason, you feel stuck. Don't we feel stuck? The liminal space is where we have left behind something, but we're not yet clear about what lies ahead, where the tried and true ways no longer produce results, but the new ways are not yet identified or tested. It is where we produce results between our previous ways of understanding and structuring our identity, time, or community, and a new way in which we feel fully confident.
The liminal state is not necessarily a state of depression where the system shuts down. It can be a state of disciplined reflection, coupled with hopeful belief that we are on the verge of a new creation. The liminal space is the perfect place for the annual conference shepherding team to begin its work. And on November 11th, we had our initial meeting. We adopted the covenant that is printed on the reverse sides of those sheets you were just looking at. We reviewed the 12 responsibilities that are set forth for us in last year's legislation, and we identified as a priority the creation of the 5-year vision plan. We made a commitment to meet in all areas of the conference. So far, we've met in Oak Park, which is in the Chicago Northwest District, in Barrington in the Elgin District, and in Rochelle and DeKalb in the DeKalb District. We've also made a commitment to maximize our visits to different locales by inviting members of the host church, cluster, or district to share with us about their ministries. Our initial such visit was at Rochelle United Methodist Church with members of that church and members of the Hub cluster. And for me personally, that meeting that we had at the conclusion of our 6-hour meeting, that extra hour that we had with people in the local church, was the most uplifting part of the day. And I think it's going to help ground our work going forward. And Reverend Hamilton, where are you? I think that your folks enjoyed it too. So on March 10th, we held a training together with the district shepherding teams that was attended by 69 people. The topic was adaptive leadership, and it was led by the noted church consultant, Susan Beaumont. It was there that we learned the term liminality and began to learn how to lead in a liminal state. Adaptive leadership is a term that we hear a lot in our conference, and it is a practice we are attempting to deploy, but that is easier said than done. So as an introduction to the term or a reminder, we've also put on your table sheets with the 10 principles of adaptive leadership. We don't have time to explore them, it's just a start. Then we began working with a strategic planning consultant, Helen Chang. Helen is a United Methodist and a member of the Urban Village Church in Wicker Park. So far, we've met with her twice, in April and in May. And Reverend McCoy is going to tell us about that.
We have 4 more meetings scheduled this year, including a meeting in August with the Cabinet. Please watch for an announcement of a meeting in your vicinity and come to share with us about ministry in your local setting. Friends, the liminal space brings us face to face with who we are, how we present ourselves to the world, our strengths and vulnerabilities, our successes and disappointments. It can cause us to question the very core of our beliefs, practices, and identities. To know thyself is the beginning of wisdom. This famous quote is often attributed to Socrates. The power of reflection lies not in the act itself, but in what we do with the knowledge that we gain from it. One thing for sure, reflection in this liminal space for its own sake accomplishes nothing. The point of self-awareness, assessment, is not in navel-gazing that encourages self-absorption or to find ourselves, but to discover what we think, what is behind our behaviors, and then to determine what we need to do about it. Yes, rather than being some abstract exercise, it is an invitation to actively change what we do and how we do it for the better, to learn to live and learn and serve with intentionality. Thus, the first step in a strategic planning process is an assessment of who we are. Part of looking at who we are is looking at that word we don't like to talk about in church, money. Conference Council on Finance Administration. The legislation creating the annual conference shepherding team provides that the Conference Council on Finance Administration will consult on the allocation of resources according to the missional priorities of the annual conference. The Conference Council on Finance Administration has been relying on the historic alignment of resources, but would like guidance in aligning them according to the strategic priorities of the conference. And the first step in discerning the strategic plan is understanding our current financial position. So the Conference Council on Finance Administration, the annual conference shepherding team, are currently engaged in a dance. At each of our meetings, the Conference Council on Finance Administration, through either Rob or Lonnie, have presented data, and we have had a conversation regarding declines in church membership and worship attendance, declines in apportionments, and the nature of our expenses. We have also engaged in a SWOT analysis, identifying our internal strengths and our weaknesses, as well as the external opportunities and threats that are amongst us. Among other things, we identified these strengths: strong passion for missions and social justice in the Northern Illinois Conference. We would all agree, wouldn't we? But we also discovered a weakness. Many times that there is a lack of clarity of why we pursue missions and justice with little or no theological underpinnings. We discovered a strength, our Wesleyan theology. Our weakness, we said, was in making disciples, lack of focus on spiritual growth, and there is a question as to how will we and whom will we share the gospel with? Many of us are used to only sharing the gospel with folk who would look like us individually. We said one of our strengths was diversity. But then we also said our weakness is a lack of identity, trying to be all things to all people, and also a weakness would be really having a sense of full inclusion. We said a strength was our relatively small geographic size as an annual conference. Our proximity enables us to meet in person. But our major weakness in this area is a lack of collaboration between our churches. We said we had a strength in clergy and churches that recognize that there is a need for change, but then we said we have a weakness. We are resistant to change and are suspicious of any kind of change that is introduced.
We will remain in the liminal state for as long as God wills. In the meanwhile, we will continue to be His church. And for the annual conference shepherding team, that means this creation of a 5-year vision plan, and that will be presented here next year. So we've already met 4 times for about 20 hours. Between now and Thanksgiving, we have another 4 meetings scheduled with our consultant, Helen Chang, and we will be joined by the cabinet in August. We've not yet identified the host churches, but we will have at least 1 meeting in the Chicago Southern District, at least 1 in the Aurora District, and at least 1 in the Rockford District. If we're coming to a church near you, please come visit with us for an hour or so in the middle of the afternoon. We want to spend time with you. We want to hear about your successes and challenges in your ministry. The more we share our stories and interact with one another across the conference, the more cohesive and stronger we will be. By the end of the year, with God's help, we hope to have completed a draft of this planning document. We will schedule listening sessions early next year to present the draft and obtain feedback. And as I said, by next year at this time, we hope to have the 5-year plan to present to you.
A strategic plan, by its nature, aims for growth. We all want to grow, don't we? Don't we? We're defining growth as the long-term sustainability and spiritual vitality necessary for the Northern Illinois Conference to thrive in an uncertain future. Long-term stability means an alignment of our membership, our finances, our clergy, and our property. Now, determining what viable levels look like. Spirituality is not yet defined. We get to envision that. We get to ask questions like, who do we serve? What do we want to be to the communities we serve? What is distinctive enough about our church to protect and preserve? What practices lead to vitality? What ministry is critical in our setting? What ministry can only we provide? How do we want to be in ministry together? What do we want our church to look like in 5 years? What is God calling us to do next? The author and writer Alan Seal says that the liminal space is an invitation to surrender, an invitation to give over to something larger than self, whom we Christians know to be our God, and to trust that we will be held and supported with whatever we need in order to navigate that uncertainty. The annual conference shepherding team invites you into the liminal space to pray and to critically examine ourselves and to finally let go to approaches of being, roles, identity, beliefs, so that something new can be created. We invite you to begin thinking about my earlier questions. Next year, you will be invited to participate in discussions regarding our draft strategic plan. And God willing, the plan will not only have priorities, it will have milestones and provide for accountability. We're not doing this hard work to create a document that sits on a shelf while our conference and churches continue to be in a free fall decline. We're doing this because we believe God is calling us to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. We're doing this because we do not have the luxury of standing around and waiting around until 2019 or 2020 to get our act together. We're doing this because we need to be better stewards of whatever resources we have and are blessed to produce. We're doing this because we find ourselves in this liminal space to discern and devote ourselves in realizing and discovering a preferred, new, and enlivening way that encourages a spirit of fruitfulness rather than continuing spiraling stagnation and decline. Borrowing from the Apostle Paul, no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the human heart conceived what God has prepared for those of us in the Northern Illinois Conference who love Him. May it be so. May it be so. Amen. May it be so.
Amen.
So you've heard some of the challenges that the shepherding team, both the annual conference